Everybody can, as you can see, this meeting is being recorded. First, let me introduce myself. I am Victor Valentine. I have the distinct privilege of being the fairly new Executive Director of the National Human Services Assembly. I am very excited to be able to essentially relaunch what we are calling our virtual learning sessions. Today's meeting is obviously about leadership practices for race equity impact, a very important and critical topic. And quite honestly, I'm very excited about our two speakers today who are very knowledgeable and going to present some critical information, but not only for information's sake, with the hopes and the expectations that if as you learn things today, that you will take them back to your organizations and discuss and maybe put strategies around that, because ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, the National Human Services Assembly's platform, is we want to encourage and support the sector by encouraging more diverse leadership. The places and spaces where our organizations are active is in every community in the United States of America. And we know that that's a mosaic of many different folks, and organizations that are able to meet the challenge of diversifying their leadership for the diverse populations that they serve is critical. So again, I am Victor Valentine. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping next before turning it over to our wonderful speakers, Monisha Kapila and Bianca Anderson. But if you could advance to the next slide. First thing we want you to do, if you can, is turn your video on. We'd love to see your smiling faces. This is an opportunity, even in a virtual setting, for us to kind of get to know each other as best as we can. And so we're excited to see you all here. If you're on the phone, please link your phone and your audio. Take a minute to rename yourself, so we don't just see an organization. And if you choose to use the hand raise option and ask a question, we'd like them to be able to call you out by name. But we are encouraging you, if you do have questions as the session goes on, that you use the chat feature. That way we'll probably be able to get to many of the questions. I will say those questions that we don't get to, we will make sure that we follow up with you after the session. We're encouraging you to write down some of the things that you hear today, either in a journal or a pad. And again, this is a lunchtime session. Under normal circumstances, we provide you with some refreshments, but feel free to have your water, coffee, tea, or snacks. Again, this meeting is being recorded, and we will be sending the link to you all after the session. We'll record it, it'll be in the cloud, and we'll send that link to you. Along with that link will be a survey. One of the things we want to do here at the Assembly is quality assurance and constant improvement. And so, we need your feedback. Want to make sure that the topics and the information and tools we're presenting are timely, are relevant, and presented in a way that really makes sense for you to ultimately take action towards the impact that I know all of us want to have. And then last but not least, we want you to save the date. This is the first of many that we're restarting and kicking off, now that I'm in this role. And the next one is on Tuesday, September 14th. It's very, very much tied into what we're going to talk about today, and that's about leadership succession planning. Today, we're going to talk in terms of, how to diversify leadership, but then you have to have a ladder and a mechanism for moving people through a continuum so that we can see more folks who are of diverse backgrounds in the C-suite as well as board of directors. Those are the real decision-making areas that can take your organization further and create more scale. So next slide, please. Really quickly about who we are. We are a membership organization comprising of many of the most comprehensive and active human services and healthcare nonprofits in the country. Some of them are very well known and recognizable, like the Boys and Girls Club, the Salvation Army. But we are ultimately trying, again, to culture an environment of racial and ethnic diversity, equitable access for all, and of course, supporting the sector through capacity building. And also we do things in the areas of public policy. And so, NHSA members are some of the nation's most engaged, and we need your help. We're trying to expand our tent. So if you have any desire after this session to know more about what membership looks like, or how you might be able to feed into some of the areas that we're covering and that we're monitoring, please reach out to us. We want to talk to you. We want to know you. We want to highlight what you're doing. And one of the main areas that we can support the sector is also we have a group purchasing program called Purchasing Point. The goal of that is to pull together resources so that you can save money towards your mission. And as you can see, since the start of that program, we've saved organizations about $212 million in operating costs. So there's a lot here at the Assembly, which we affectionately call it, but we hope that you stay connected to us after this session, and that you think seriously about joining us and creating more of a groundswell so that we can make the impact we want to make. So with that, I will turn it over to Monisha. Again, thank you both, Monisha and Bianca, for leading this discussion, and look forward to hearing more from you all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Victor. It is really great to be here with you all. As he mentioned, I'm Monisha Kapila. I am the founder and co-CEO at ProInspire. I'm also a board member at the National Human Services Assembly. So it's a real honor to be here wearing multiple hats, and just appreciative for the leadership of Victor, Melissa, Ruth, and the entire Assembly team to kick off these virtual learning sessions, because one of the things that the board has been talking about over the past year is really the need for us to be in community with each other about important issues that many organizations are facing. I'm excited to be here with my co-CEO. I want to invite Bianca to introduce yourself.
Hi, greetings. I'm Bianca Anderson. So happy to be with you all as well. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Dallas, Texas native, and currently residing in Washington, D.C.
So we're going to share with you today a little bit about ProInspire and the work that we've been doing around leadership practices for race equity impact. We'll share our research, and then we're going to have some interactive discussions to really hear from all of you about how this is showing up in your organizations. But first, about ProInspire, we are a nonprofit. We envision an equitable and just society free of systemic oppression where all people thrive. And the place that we focus our mission around that is to activate leaders at all levels to accelerate equity. And we do that by working at the individual, organizations, and systems levels. Our hope is that leaders at all levels have the competencies, confidence, and connections to accelerate equity. And so the leadership model we're going to be sharing is really one tool to support how do we shift our norms around leadership to really have accelerating equity being core to that. And as Victor already mentioned, to please include your name, and if you'd like, you can include your pronouns. But we want to just get a sense of who's in the room. So if you can chat in where you're joining from in your role, and if you'd like your favorite ice cream or sherbet or froyo or whatever flavor that is, just so we can get a sense of who's here. So we'll take a minute for people to share that in. All right, great. Good. So nice to have you, Carla, from Youth Advocate Programs, and Laura from Girls Inc. Kathy, another Dallas person. Lakia, so nice to see you. And you like the kind of two ice creams that Bianca and I like. Jackie, welcome from Baltimore. Denise, another board member. Great to see folks from so many different organizations. Wonderful. And invite, as folks are coming in, to just feel free to share that, but we will continue in. So our goals for this session are to give an overview of the ProInspire Leading for Race Equity Impact Model. We're going to explore some of the leadership practices that accelerate race equity. And then we want to end with everyone brainstorming a personal commitment to fostering race equity within your organization. When we have conversations about race equity, it can be really helpful for us to have some community agreements. Even though we're not together for a long time, we wanted to share some community agreements that we hold at ProInspire and invite us to use those today. So first, invite you to be a learner, to engage with bravery and curiosity, to take space and make space. And part of that is thinking about, if If we haven't shared, how can we take space and share? If we've shared a lot, how can we make space for others? But also thinking about, whose voices are often heard the most, and how do we make space for those who aren't? Listen, 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 and process. So how are we listening from our head, from our hearts, from our bodies, and processing what people are sharing? Speak from the I, and acknowledge and attend to impact. And this is, recognizing that sometimes we will share something that our intent may not have been harmful, but it may have harmful impact, and that it's important to acknowledge and attend to that. These may be things, if you have had conversations about race equity, that sound familiar, and if they're not, just invite you to think about how community agreements can support you in having these conversations in your organization. And so now I'm going to invite Bianca to talk a little bit more about ProInspire's foundational beliefs and our leadership model.
Yes, thank you, Monisha. And similar to the practice of creating community agreements, one of the things that our work, our research and our work has really illuminated for us is that in creating the container to have courageous and brave conversations, there are some underlying beliefs or things that really undergird how we can approach these conversations. So before we look more deeply at the leadership model, we want to just share with you some of the beliefs that we have found to be really essential to creating more equitable outcomes in the social sector. First is to center race equity through our work. That looks like active learning and unlearning, intentional action, and processes for accountability. We've also found it important to prioritize authenticity, allyship, solidarity, and strategic action to interrupt oppression and advance race equity. Develop your race equity analysis, both personally and professionally. Embody leadership practices from any position within an organization, and identify how to redefine, reimagine, and change institutions and systems from your role within the organization. So these are a few of the beliefs that kind of really have supported us in developing this leadership model. And now I'm going to go through the leadership model with you in a little more detail. So first, with ProInspire, what we really do believe is that a leader can lead at any level within an organization. So when we think about leading, we're looking at leading self, leading people, leading organizations, and leading within the system. So no matter what your role is, we can lead ourselves, we can lead with our colleagues, lead as an organization level, and also recreate and reimagine in that system. So for each of those kind of leadership windows, there's a core belief, something that feels very foundational to accelerating equity. When thinking about leading self, our core belief is a sense of identity. So what are we learning and unlearning about who we are as people, as individuals? When leading people, we're thinking about centering relationship. We found it essential to being able to create more equitable experience that we actually put people first. And so that feels paramount to creating more equitable experience. Then also leading organizations, being in alignment with our values. So really being who we say we are, and as an organization, having policies and practices that are in alignment with what we believe. And then at the systems level, collective reimagining, taking what has worked for us in the past, and maybe even reimagining what the future could be at a collective level. So those are some of the foundational values that undergird the model. And then as you look within the model, there are the 3 A's. So our process for really operationalizing these practices includes active learning and unlearning. We found that we've all been socialized to believe some things about professionalism or standards within the organizations that may not serve us, right? So there's a moment of like active learning and unlearning, or constant moments of active learning and unlearning that we undertake. And with those new learnings, we want to move to action, right? We want to do something with the things that we're learning, but we also want to do it intentionally. So the second A is intentional action. And then following that, we have processes for accountability. So how do we actually create processes and procedures that can hold us accountable to these new behaviors and new beliefs? One of the things that's important to point out about those 3 A's is that they really do run in circles, right? Like the process never ends. Once you created a process for accountability, you might learn something or unlearn something that starts that cycle all over again. And then within the body of the model, we have these 12 different practices that we're creating or building tools around that can help leaders to operationalize things like inner well-being, conscious communication, co-creating culture, and understanding inequities. These are the more strategic or tactical leadership approaches that help to create a more equitable outcomes. So as we think about what this really looks like in practice, we're shifting away from white dominant norms to behaviors that advance race equity, creating more inclusive workplaces and inclusive norms. Some of the ways this might look: instead of having leadership by an individual, we're shifting to leadership by the collective. Instead of being focused on productivity, we're creating more adaptive and flexible environments. As opposed to objective, one right way, we have to hold ourselves at a very kind of almost, I don't want to say callous, but no feelings level within our organization. We want to be vulnerable, engage with curiosity, and be open. And then also, instead of having decisions made by those in power, those who are most impacted by the decision should actually be the decision makers. So as I shared a moment ago, for each of the leadership windows, there's leading self, people, organizations, and systems, right? And there's a core belief. And so here in a moment, we're going to go a little bit deeper into how these core beliefs have actually been showing up within the sector by sharing a few examples. So as we think about leading self, sense of identity is really fundamental to being able to create more equitable outcomes and experiences. And when we say sense of identity, we're talking about leading self in ways that address internalized racism and oppression, compassionately working to cultivate well-being, and also understanding how we've been socialized. Here's an example of this. And this last sentence really strikes me. Naming how our ways of showing up have roots in the oppressive and violent structures of this place and time break open what is possible. This piece was written by Helen Talley, White Women Doing White Supremacy in Nonprofit Culture. And what the full piece really explains is how she took some time to think about how she had been socialized as a white woman and how that was actually showing up within the organization and her leadership. Next, we have leading people. So the foundational value or the core belief here is centering relationships. So when leading people, we're addressing our biases. We're addressing how interpersonal interactions can reinforce racial hierarchy and exclusion. We're reversing that by really putting a focus on people. And this is an example from Compass Point. This piece was called "We Can't Work Toward Racial Justice Without Working on Relationships." And something that really sticks out from here is when we go to work and we know that we are cared for, valued, and believed in, it allows us to feel a sense of belonging and pride and a level of togetherness that can't be appraised. And really, the shift is, as opposed to focusing on productivity and just getting things done, when leading people from a space of equity, we're focusing on the whole person and the well-being of the people that we work with.
Thanks, Bianca. I think for me, around those core beliefs, I've had so much unlearning to do in the last kind of decade plus that I've led ProInspire. Looking at sense of identity, when I started the organization, a lot of it was rooted in some of my childhood experiences growing up as a first-generation immigrant in Flint, Michigan, and working with a lot of nonprofits. But when I was starting my career, I didn't see people who looked like me at nonprofits. So I didn't see that as a career path. And many years later, I was able to do that. But when I started the organization, I didn't tell that story, and I didn't feel like that was something that was important to why I was starting the organization. So it's taken a lot of time for me to really unpack some of the internalized racism that and to be able to say, like, that actually is really powerful and important for me to share. And when we've worked with organizations, a few years ago, we worked with a board of directors that was looking to develop criteria for hiring a new executive director. And we shared that with them, like you should ask about kind of sense of identity that people have, because that's important to understand what's their story and why they care about this work and how it connects to the organization's mission. And on leading people, some of my prior experiences were in the business world, which is much more transactional relationships. And a big learning for me is kind of how do I get in touch with some of that natural instinct to center relationships, but then actually ensure that that's kind of a practice in the organization, that we, not just center relationships one-on-one, but say this is a way of working. Some of the two other windows I'll share about are the leading organizations aligning values. And this is really addressing norms, policies, and procedures that perpetuate white supremacy by aligning values. I would say that, over the last year, we've seen a huge rise in organizations who are really having some questions about whether they are aligning to their values. Many organizations that made statements after George Floyd's murder to share that they believe that Black Lives Matter and that race equity is important to them, but then really, staff questioning, but do our values, do our policies and practices actually align with these values? And there's a growing number of examples of organizations who've spent some time really trying to do that. One that I found helpful, actually, it was a National Human Services Assembly gathering a few years ago, where the Nanette Sykes, who used to lead this work at Casey, came and shared about their experience, and she's published it on their website on a document called Operationalizing Equity. But really, they had a 3-year intentional focus on learning across the entire organization, every staff member, whether you're on the finance team or the grants team, to really look at how do they make changes to align with their race equity values. And what I think is really important is that every single person and every single team identified areas that they could shift to align with values. Oftentimes, HR is the first one that people think about, and that definitely has been an area that they focused on, but also things like procurement, and how are they setting standards for identifying vendors and selection and payment terms. Some of these things that may have been in place may really perpetuate inequities around larger organizations, which are more likely to be white-led to always get those contracts. Another was grants management, and how does grants management prioritize relationships? That it's not just transactional roles of foundations. Communications was another area, which is how do we, as we are at nonprofits or foundations, think about our role around addressing race equity through the work we do in communications, the stories we tell, even the journalists that we work with to tell about the work of our organizations. And the fourth window is around leading systems. And this is around, how do we address inequities by disaggregating outcomes by race? So actually understanding where are there racial disparities, and then partnering with others in the ecosystem to reimagine the sector. And so one of the core things that's part of leading systems is recognizing each organization can't change the outcomes on their own. And it is important to see yourself as part of that ecosystem. Another example on this is actually Demos, which is a policy organization that in 2014 started their own work around operationalizing race equity, and they've published this on their website. And part of what they did was really articulate how race equity connects to the work that Demos does in the system. So as a policymaker, that it is really important for them to understand not just on communities of color, but also how to connect inequality and democracy and in the economy. So race equity is kind of a connector to that. Also, the role that they play around addressing the fact that progressive class politics fall apart on race. So kind of seeing how this plays out, that it's more than a black and white story, and that there's intersections between race and other group identities. So these were kind of ways that they sort of set, if we're going to reimagine the systems, like how do we set some principles that will support us to do that? So now we want to pause and just take a few, if there's any questions on these core beliefs before we have some group conversation about what is showing up in your experience around what's working around these and what are some challenges. So just wanted to pause first so to see if there's any questions. And feel free to chat in or to raise your hand if you'd like. All right, well, why don't we go then to kind of some of the group discussion we want to have. So we're putting into the chat what's called a Padlet, and I'll do a quick demonstration of it so you can see this is what it looks like. So if you can go to the link, you'll see this. And what we want you to do is this is kind of a brainstorm. Like if we were in a room together, we'd be putting stuff up on flip charts. To brainstorm on each of these 4 core beliefs: sense of identity, centering relationships, aligning values, and collective reimagining of your work in the system. What is working around that for you or for your organization? And what are some challenges that you're facing? And we want to give you some time to put that in, because then we'd like to have some full group conversation. How can we learn from each other about what's working and what challenges we're facing as it relates to leadership and race equity, and particularly on those 4 areas? So do anyone have questions or challenges getting to the Padlet? All right. Okay. So we'll give you a few minutes, and we'll play some music in the background while you do that.
Under title, do you want the name of our organization? What do you want under the title component?
Oh, and under the title, no, it's really just the actual. Thanks for naming that. Just the name of the issue, and then if you want to put like a description, you can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, music. Here we go.
Monisha, we have a question. If you could put up the slide that shows the definitions of them.
Oh yes. Hold on one second. You able to hear the music? And I'll pull up the slide. I can do each one. I'll do this. So this is sense of identity. Entering relationships. Aligning values. And collective reimagining. And we can actually page for that as well. Oh, great. So Bianca's making a slide with all 4, I think.
Monisha, that music has me bouncing over here.
Yes. It's a group called Black Violin. They're amazing.
Nice.
Also, you'll see on the Padlet you can heart things. So if someone wrote something, you don't have to repeat it. You can just heart it.
So I tried to put all 4 together in case folks needed it.
And so much great stuff people are adding to the Padlet. Take just a couple more minutes. There's a lot on here already for us to talk through. All right, Bianca, going to take us to some discussion.
Yes, sure. Okay, so I haven't had a chance to look at the Padlet yet because I was sharing.
I can start us off then. There's a lot of great stuff on here. So maybe we could start with sense of identity. And I'm curious, as you're looking on here, kind of any patterns that you're seeing or things that you're seeing others doing that maybe could be opportunities for your organization. One of the things that I was seeing was that some of the kind of organizations that are in this group, issues that they focus on are tied to identity areas that have faced oppression. And so that has given a strong connection to that.
Mhm.
Other things that are coming up for folks. And if you aren't in gallery view, I invite you to do that now so we can see each other. One of the things I do see on the challenges around sense of identity is how the history can be a challenge, particularly if there's a history of exclusion, as well as board members having shared identities and how that there can be unspoken beliefs around that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm also seeing in a challenge this buy-in, right? Like whether it's like getting larger momentum for the buy-in, or should we make it required or optional? And that's something that often comes up, especially with sense of identity, because these things are so personal. And historically, we've been taught like you leave that at the door. You come to the job, you do your work, and you leave who you are at the door, right? So I would love to have some conversations around how folks are navigating that particular challenge. Has it been coming up for anyone? See if you had Don's. I can give an example as we're thinking. So for us last year, especially after George Floyd's murder and a lot of uprisings that were happening, we kept wanting to have conversations about this, but we also knew it takes a toll, right? Especially for me as a Black woman, it took a toll. And we started talking with our team, but also our board on, so what do we do? Like, how do we actually support individuals? And we started a wellness fund. Because one of the things that we found is if we're asking people to bring in their self, right, and their whole self, we also want to provide ways to actually bring some comfort to yourself in your life, right? And so we're continued that even this year. So having like access so folks can take care of themselves in a monetary way, right? So take some time off and be able to just treat yourself and do things for yourself that you need.
That's a great example, Bianca. Another one I'll share. I saw this actually come up as something that's been working in a lot of groups is affinity groups. And we've seen this be something really helpful as it relates to sense of identity. More and more organizations are supporting their staff to create racially focused identity groups. So that might be a space for Black staff to come together, for Asian staff, for white staff. And I think that's, organizations that followed the employee resource group model that has kind of been popularized in the corporate world, really focused on the minority as being the group that needed that space. And I think what race equity invites us to think about is how does everyone actually need to have a sense of identity and think about how that connects to their role in solidarity and allyship. And so we've seen a growing number of organizations saying we actually need space for white staff to come together, to have a white anti-racist affinity group, and to actually have some conversations and support around how they should be showing up.
Yeah, Shanna?
Hi, sorry, my throat's a little scratchy, but in the vein of affinity groups, what we are practicing now is that we try to remind folks that the racial equity work is very challenging. And so it's okay to develop affinity groups that are not identity-based. So to have like, a breathwork affinity group, or one of the affinity groups that we helped to develop was like a Netflix nerds group. But if we want to continue the work is to maybe put parameters around the affinity groups. So one of the things that, I helped affinity groups to think about is like, you can have an affinity group for whatever you want, but maybe about 30% of your time should be dedicated to the liberation and the support of other oppressed groups in the agency. And so that way people can have their breath work, they can have their Netflix nerds and like debate which are the hot documentaries in Netflix. But when we show up to an affinity council, they're able to say like, we talked about the murder of Breonna Taylor. We also talked about mass incarceration for our clients. Here are the top 5 Netflix documentaries we've argued are good for the staff to watch in relation to those subjects, so that people are engaged in their interests, but they're also engaged in the equity work as well.
That's great. I love that. And I haven't heard of a lot of orgs doing that. So I see a lot of nodding heads. I don't know if you're open to any follow-up questions that might come up, but even just seeing like how you set some of those guidelines could be helpful for others.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Why don't should we go to centering relationships?
Mm-hmm.
You can take a look at what people have been sharing.
Yeah, what's working, commitment from leadership, right? So whether it's the ED, but folks who are decision makers for the organization, really their commitment and willingness, especially as things get challenging. That's great that that's working. What's helping that to work? Anyone want to share, like getting that buy-in from executive leadership? What's made that work?
I can share a little bit on that, Denise, with the National Community Action Network. And it really came from empowering our board and listening to our board and seeing them as the leaders of the organization. They're the representatives in the field across the country, and that they've been able to push the team of staff and have put agency resources behind it. It's been that the board members who may come from areas where they're less comfortable having some really deep conversations, that relationship so matters within that boardroom, that the board as a whole is able to develop those relationships and do some really deep work and then push the organization forward, which has really been great to see.
Denise, that's so helpful. I see that that's come up as one of the challenges has been around board members. And so I'm just curious if you've faced any challenges with that and things that you found to be supportive.
And our board members tend to be executive directors of local nonprofit organizations, so they're a little bit different than sometimes other typical typical board members, but they face some of the same challenges when they're in that room, because they represent a certain constituency in their own organization and have to navigate that. But having a very strong executive committee who is fully bought into all of the conversations and all the work of the organization and willing to approve budgetary investments for big events or staff training or board training. We hosted our conference or our board retreats in places that we hope will matter and deepen the conversation. So it's that executive committee that's really been able to take the lead deeply.
Great. Thank you.
Denise, thank you. I was going to follow up and ask about, you mentioned resources, because that's there's a lot of good feeling about it. There's a lot of want to, but then there is actually, I always say, show me your priorities by showing me your line items, whether that's in money and or the time you allocate towards something. So you just hit on it on how they're supporting.
Budgets are moral documents, right? And they tell the story about where you're putting your time, talent, and treasure.
That's right.
I see Dakota also shared one of the things that's coming up in the Padlet is just tensions between white folks and folks of color in different communities. And Dakota, thank you for sharing about kind of what's happening locally between white queer folks and queer folks of color. I also saw that kind of came up around BIPOC and white presenting Jewish staff in some organizations. So I'm just curious if others have dealt with similar tensions and how they've navigated that. And I can start with giving some examples from our work. We last year were working with a nonprofit based in Central Texas. And what was interesting was they had an affinity group, a people of color affinity group that started the race equity work for the organization. And so they were really leading that. But what started to come up was they felt like the white folks weren't taking on enough responsibility. And the white folks were saying, well, we want to, you say take space, make space. We to follow in this because this was started by the BIPOC affinity group, and so we were doing some work with them, and we said it's probably time to reconstitute. Like, let's name what's happening, and reconstitute some of our expectations, but to actually say for the BIPOC staff, like, we want you to lead in the ways that make sense, but also for you not to carry all of the burden. And for white staff, we want you to take greater responsibility on this work. And what does that look like? And so it required some really candid conversations. It can be helpful to have facilitation for that, because those who are inside, could be really hard. And, even at ProInspire, when we've done our internal work, we often have external facilitators help us with that, because, it's important for someone who can come in and take that balcony view and say, this is what I see showing up here, and what might be some underlying things that you need to address.
Monisha or Bianca, how since we're talking about tensions, and anybody feel free to chime in on this, how do you manage through the tension of, it's not an either or mindset when you're doing this work? It's not at the expense of others. It is truly an inclusion. It's an and proposition. Because I know that when you get, it can be very personal. It can be very, almost as if I'm not being represented in this work versus, yes, you are, because we are all. So how have you managed some of those tensions?
Bianca, you want to take that?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from other folks because this is one that definitely, I think, comes up so many places. For us, we really want to talk about the mindset, right? Like there are ways where we've been taught to believe in scarcity, not enoughness. So if someone gets, then I lose. And that's not actually what equity is, right? That's not what inclusion is. It's because someone gets, we get more, right? And so it's really shifting from scarcity to abundance. And also thinking about we all need different things. So it may not look the same for everyone, but because someone gets more does not mean that you get less inclusion, right? It doesn't work that way with inclusion. Anyone else want to add? Yeah, it's not a pie. Okay. Go ahead, Elisa.
Yeah, Elise, I think what I've learned is that when this is brought into a conversation, the framing of it is the most important thing. So when you want to do, like, I'm a strategist. So when you want to get buy-in, that actually should take most of your time. And then the strategy is really the short part of the piece. And people don't spend the time on the framing of it. And so what I mean by that is, if the focus is on values and the intentionality of the group, most people want to do what's good and most people want to do what's right. But if you can address the fears and all those things up front and say, this is what it is and this is what it isn't. And it's almost like creating an FAQ, like a frequently asked questions, where you anticipate the questions in advance. And you're saying, here are questions about this subject matter. Does it mean I give up something? Does it mean this? And so you actually put it out there. What you do is you create, or I found, it has allowed me to create a different kind of safe space. So I've done this in the Indigenous community where we're trying, in Canada, it's a very big thing in terms of our Truth and Reconciliation report of trying to deal with the inequities that have taken place and in this community. But a lot of people who are not educated in Indigenous actually feel very uncomfortable because they don't know the difference between the term Indigenous or Aboriginal, and so they walk into that conversation already feeling like they may not belong or they may misinterpret. So they don't bring their whole selves in. So we did a whole FAQ of every possible question we could think of before people even went into the workshop. We went through it, and then all of a sudden it was a different workshop. We did the same thing with our board, which had for 97 years 100% Jewish board membership. And we talked about the fact our clients are diverse. Our board doesn't reflect that diversity, but instead of doing it like a tokenism, kind of here are one or two spots on the board, in parallel, we looked at the values of the organization on our biggest issues, and we changed our recruitment policy to make it accessible to non-Jewish board members, and in some cases of color, but where they came in with a lot of expertise. So the people, when they came onto the board, it wasn't a token role. They were valued, they had power, they had influence on the board. So it just had a totally different feel of saying, okay, we need to have, this percentage, or it was more of it was helping us further our goals and our values versus detracting.
Elisa, at least that's so helpful. And I think some of the things you shared connect with what we've learned in our work, which is shared understanding is really needed. And we often say training doesn't equal change, but sort of training or shared language and analysis is foundational. And so sometimes, when we work with organizations, we'll ask them, can you make sure that everyone has done a training with Race Forward or Crossroads or Racial Equity Institute, so that you all come in with a shared language around what this means. And so I really like, Elise, how you just even had like the list of questions. And then the second piece is on alignment, which is to be able to move this work forward. As you said, a lot of the time is not actually in defining the strategy, it's actually aligning on what do we need to do and how do we approach it. Well, you started to go into aligning values. And so we only have a little bit of time left, but see kind of what's coming up for folks. I see affinity groups and alignment of values and how people talk about that as being something that's working. And some of the challenges I'm seeing is, when the values aren't clear or people have different values, as well as kind of who might feel defensive when it comes to how are we operationalizing. I see kind of HR can feel defensive because oftentimes it's the first place that people experience inequity or feel like there's misalignment of values. How are any examples of how groups are tackling that? I'll share at ProInspire, this has been an ongoing area of work for us for the past at least 3 years around, particularly on the HR space, aligning values and our internal HR practices. And we're a small organization with 10 people. And so sometimes it can feel like, how many processes do we need? But we recognize that for us to have our values really these things that people can live into, that, leadership at all levels, that we do believe in equitable experience and outcomes, that means we have to put a lot of intentionality into those things. It has meant that we have to engage partners and bring in outside expertise to support us on things like compensation, compensation and performance feedback and things. Because I think we're also in a moment where what people are realizing the way those have been done in the past are not equitable. So there's not a roadmap to how to create it in the future. And so we've really leaned into getting support on that.
Yeah. And the next thing I'll add to that is the active learning and unlearning, right? Like really using a learner stance around like HR policy, right? And how we can just name that this has not been to create more justice, right? So some of these policies have not really been equity facing. So how do we look at it with a different lens and be like, okay, let's experiment with some new behaviors?
Well, I can add, this is Denise again, as we look to remote work options going forward, we've had to take a hard look at what our historical practices were with who was hired as a remote staff and what positions weren't. And we've redone a lot of that, and we will have more formalized policies this fall. But it's that ability to call it out in our leadership team meetings. If we're in that comfort level in that space that, well, this decision doesn't seem to align with our decision over here. This seems to reinforce structural inequity. That's not our intent. What do we need to do to pivot? So in that leadership team room, there's a level of being able to call each other, well, calling me out. I'll just put it out there when I am not when I am not being as forward thinking and as equitable as I should be in policy conversations.
Thanks, Denise. I think Bianca sort of internally has kind of asked us this question, which is what does accessibility look like in this new world? That in the past kind of accessibility was oftentimes focused on questions focused on individuals who identify as having disabilities. But we are in a world where we're really having to think about our accommodations, accessibility. What does that mean? And how might we need to think about accommodations for folks with different needs that may not be, tied to disabilities, but other things that come up. We have just a couple minutes left. So collective reimagining. I see some of the things that are working is just, having space and setting time to do this and thinking about it. And some of the challenges has been that it can happen sort of in silos or not at all, given that we have, many places have been remote. Any orgs that have been thinking about how are they collectively reimagining the work that they do in the system? Yeah, Elise?
So one of the challenges I have is I've come to an organization where some people have been there 31 years and some people have, like myself, are fairly recent, been brought in. And because of our union policy, and I don't know whether or not this occurs in other social service agencies, we only hire people in the union at entry level. So bad practices get taught by the other people, like bad habits get taught, bad practices as well as good ones, but it's very hard for newcomers to really challenge people that have been there longer and have been doing this work longer. There wasn't a lot of hiring with people with the technical skills. We're an immigrant agency, so we try to bring in immigrants and create opportunities for them. So we're trying to be inclusive. So a couple of changes have been really thinking about the skills that we need to bring at the table. So I always ask, who's not at our table? Who has an opinion different than ours that we need for this collective thinking? So we've changed the way our board looks at strategy by actually bringing in newcomers that know very little about our strategy to actually sit in on some of those strategy sessions. And what it does is it lets someone who's not biased or myopic actually ask us questions that we maybe become too insular. The second thing we've done is we work a lot in talking about where do we see ourselves 3 years from now? If someone walked into the agency, who would they see? Who would be greeting them? What languages would they speak? What would the people look like in the room? And we really try and paint those pictures. And by focusing 3 years down the road, people stop talking about, but we can't do that now, or we're not there now. So it gets all those naysayers away. But for me, it's really been bringing different people to the table and creating ground rules where people really know that their job is sometimes not to give the solution, but to ask the questions. So we've been putting a lot of values on good questions, but we still run into issues. I wish I could say it was so simple. We've done the training, we do the stuff, and you always have someone who tries to pull you back. So we've been putting in a lot of systems and processes to kind of break that down.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think this is an area that we feel like there's so much more for us to do as a sector around collectively reimagining and looking at how do we really create a world of race equity and liberation together. We only have a couple minutes left, so I do want to just pause and say thank you. We're going to put into the chat a survey link.
We are.
Yeah, Victor, anything you want to share?
No. First, let me just say thank you to both of you, Monisha and Bianca, as well as everybody who has participated, both verbally and in the chat, and just joining us today. I think that regardless of whether you actively said or wrote anything, I think it's just important for you to be here and to continue the conversation. Again, at the end of this long journey is ultimately seeing the impact of when you look into the spaces and places that you work and that you walk, it looks different than it does today. And so there's a journey for us to get there. We're all here to walk hand in hand in that. So again, thank you for everyone here who participated. Just to wrap up again, we will be sending the link to the slides. So anything that you wanted to take a harder look at, that'll be available to you. We're putting a survey link in the chat box, and we also will be following up with an email that has that as well. Please, it does so much. The 5 minutes it takes for you to fill that survey out goes a long way in helping us get better at putting these on and identifying topics that are relevant and they mean things to you. At the very bottom of this slide, you'll see, again, save the date, Tuesday, September 14th. That's leadership succession planning. We just heard very loud and clear that when you have hiring practices that are focused on the entry level and those opportunities that may not be higher on the scale, it's very difficult to make change. Again, we're talking about how do we change the faces and voices in areas of leadership and decision making. I always like to take one or two things away myself, and based on what I heard today, I heard very loud and clear: buy-in first and strategy is second. Making sure that we get everybody on board before we can even talk about what are we going to do. Xander said it's not a pie. I'm going to run with that. Hope he doesn't have that licensed or copywritten. And budgets are moral documents. You have to put resources behind this work. It's not enough to say we want to and that we've got a plan or we have a document or a statement that we're putting on our websites. You have to actually do something. And in order to do that, we all know that resources, and that's time, that's sweat equity, and it is money. You can't be afraid the same way we can't be afraid to talk in terms of race. We also can't be afraid to talk in terms of money when it comes to this work. So again, on behalf of the National Human Services Assembly and my team that put this together, I want to thank Melissa and Ruth for their effort. Again, thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Goodbye.